My name is Mary Jean, and I'm going to be hosting the climate panel this evening. We're going to have 4 experts joining us. We have 3 of them so far. We have Dr. Madhav Kandikar and Sir Bob Lyman, Tom Harris, and Dr. Jay Lehr is also going to be joining us as well. We're going to learn about lots of different things to do with climate science, energy, public policy, as well as the different policies that the government has been inflicting upon us, both in Canada and around the world due to the supposed climate change emergency. And so, without further ado, I will introduce the panelists. So, Dr. Madhav Kandikar is a retired Environment Canada scientist, and he was an expert reviewer for the IPCC. IPCC is a UN climate body in 2007 climate change documents. He has a Master's of Science in Statistics from India and a Master's of Science and PhD in Meteorology from the USA. Dr. Kandikar continues his research at present in extreme weather in Canada and elsewhere on interannual variability of Indian-Asian monsoon. So he's going to be talking about some extreme weather. So thank you for joining us, Madhav.
Thank you.
Next we have Robert Lyman. He's a retired economist and public servant who has spent over 40 years analyzing and advising on energy, environment, and transportation policy in Canada. He spent the first 10 years of his career as a foreign service officer with postings to the Canadian embassies in Caracas, Venezuela, and Washington, D.C. Since 2015, he's been increasingly involved as a commentator on climate-related policy issues in Canada. So thank you and welcome, Robert Lyman.
Glad to be here.
Great. And so we also have Dr. Jay Lehr. Tom, is Jay coming?
Oh, I don't see him here.
I think he still needs a Google account, so he's probably going to do it through his wife.
Oh, okay.
All right.
We'll know
Sounds
soon.
good. All right, so when he comes on, I'll just give his bio. Dr. Jay Lehr received a PhD from Princeton and a PhD in hydrology from the University of Arizona. He taught at the University of Arizona and the Ohio State University before heading to the National Association of Groundwater Scientists and Engineers, followed by 25 years with the Heartland Institute. And he's now the Senior Policy Analyst with the International Climate Science Coalition, which is ICSC. And he will be joining us shortly. And last, we have Tom Harris. Tom has a bachelor's and master's degree in mechanical engineering with a thermofluids and energy focus. He has 43 years experience working as a mechanical engineer and project manager, science and technology communications professional, and media and science and tech advisor for a former opposition senior environment critic in Canada's federal parliament. For the past 22 years, he has been working with a team of scientists and engineers to promote a sensible approach to energy and environmental issues, climate change in particular, with the International Climate Science Coalition, ICSC, as well as International Climate Science Coalition Canada, which I'm also a part of. So when Jay joins us, we will get started on our questions. And if anyone has any questions throughout the talk, please just indicate it in the comments and I will make a question queue. So once our panelists are done answering the key questions, I'll go through and you can turn on your microphone and ask the speakers your question. So since we're going to have Jay doing the first question, but if everyone's okay with that, maybe I'll just switch things around a bit. And Madhav, I will ask you your question first. So you're definitely an expert in extreme weather, and we would like to know, is extreme weather increasing in Canada and around the world? And are there any connections with extreme weather and global warming? We often hear this in the media. So what is your take on this?
Hello, can you hear me all?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, okay. I think we have been talking about extreme weather quite a bit in last few years. But to understand the perspective, extreme weather has been an integral part of the Earth's climate system. Extreme weather were always there, no matter what. It's only that we are starting to talk about it now. Even when, to give an example, when the Earth's climate was cooling down from about 1945 to 1977-78, we had extreme weather events, but we didn't talk about it. Now, when global warming started and people said, oh, global warming makes extreme weather more. Why? There is no real physical basis provided by IPCC about why there is more or why there are more extreme weather events. All they say is that a warmer climate holds more moisture. So what happens? We get thunderstorms in one area. In other area, there is no rain. So that morphed into more rain in some area, no rain in other area. So we have extreme rain event some area, no rain at all. And maybe that leading to drought or something like that. So that's about all. There is no physical basis for that. And so now what happens? Now as the climate has warmed, we see some rain events here and there, and we see some heat waves here and there. And we all say, oh, see, this is what is happening. Heat waves are part of this extreme weather that IPCC has been saying. But we forget the fact that during the 1920s and 1930s, what are known commonly in North America as the Dust Bowl years, they were the hottest decades on the North American plains. Quite possibly, hot weather prevailed in parts of Australia, then also perhaps parts of Europe. We don't know exactly. But then we had lots of extreme weather events, extreme droughts, extreme cold, but we didn't talk about it. Then we started now this global warming cycle, or as I say, we got into this global warming debate, and we say, extreme weather is increasing. But that is a false perception, or what I call a perception. We are now finding that every little weather event, like a big rainfall event somewhere, or somewhere a heat wave somewhere in Australia, we all start to run about it. Say, oh, there is the extreme weather. And extreme weather is definitely linked to global warming. So it is more a perception, media-driven perception. The media was not talking about extreme weather 40 years ago. I give you one example. In November 12-13, 1970, a tropical cyclone, Bhola, hit East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. And that tropical cyclone killed over 250,000 people. It was a very sad event. And what happened? If some of you recall, there was hardly any news about it. The news about tropical cyclone Bhola killing 250,000 people of East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh a year later, possibly because of that horrible event. It was hardly discussed in Canadian newspapers. In fact, there was one news item somewhere on the third or fourth page, if I recall. I remember this very well because of our very good friend Tad Murthy, who is no more with us. He has done a lot of work on Bay of Bengal tropical cyclone. So the point I'm making is that when during these cooling of the climate, we had extreme weather events, nobody paid much attention to that. Now, fast forward, August 30, 2005, Hurricane Katrina. About 1,000 people died very sadly again. Then what happened? Now the whole media blows up. Everybody talks about, see, we told you extreme weather will be happening more. Hurricanes will become stronger now. We have to watch for it. Oh, really? What happened 40 years ago when the hurricane tropical cyclone hit Bangladesh then? Or previous in 1969, there was this great Hurricane Camille, which hit the Bay St. Louis, and it killed about 250 people. So hurricanes were stronger even in 60s and 70s, but we didn't talk about it. Now we are suddenly linking everything to extreme weather. So what I'm trying to say is that extreme weather was always with us and will always be with us. Whether we remove 1 billion tons of CO2 or 10 billion tons of CO2. We just have to prepare for it. And I'll be answering more questions later as the discussion go along. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I also pasted some articles in the chat if anyone wants to learn more that you've written. That sounds great. So we're actually going to have Jay Lehr on speakerphone with Tom. So if you would like to get that going, we'll ask Jay the next question. I'm just going to make sure that.
Are you ready, Jay?
I'm very ready, more than ready. Hi. Loaded for bear.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for joining us. I'm glad we've got you on. So I've already done the introductions. And so the question I'd like to ask you is, what is the extent of humanity's impact on climate change due to carbon dioxide? And also, if you'd like to touch on the impact on sea level, I understand that you're an expert on sea level as well.
I'm an expert on all of it. I've been doing little else for the last 40 years, but looking at climate when every major magazine in the United States had a cover story about global cooling in the 70s. I have a collection of them. And the object, of course, is to control society with fear. So cooling was the way in the 70s. Didn't work out so well. And those wanting to control society with fear switched over to global warming. Al Gore led the charge, and it was more effective. But when we weren't warming, they did away with the global warming fear and went to climate change. And there are no days on Earth that you can't look to a changing climate. So the people that thought they could cash in on this fear in academia, mostly funded by the government, sat down and wrote mathematical equations that they thought would simulate the way nature controls our climate. They actually funded 117 different academic models through the federal government, which spent billions on it. No two models, these mathematical equations intended to simulate how the climate works, no two agreed with each other, and none were able to predict backwards. When you have a simulation of how things work, the first thing you do is you try to calibrate it by looking backwards where you have all the answers historically, and no single model was able to actually show what the climate was 10 years in historically. And then the models have been around for a couple decades now, and so they did have predictions that they made for 10 and 20 years out. No single prediction has ever been correct. So the models have failed. Now, they failed because they do not take into account all the variables. None can do that because there are so many variables. So I'll first give you my answer, and I'll then explain the variables that appear in none of these mathematical equations, which are called climate models. I am thoroughly convinced that man's impact on the climate of the planet is zero. Carbon dioxide does create a greenhouse effect. which keeps the planet warm enough for plants to grow, animals to live off the plants, and man to live. Were it not for carbon dioxide, planet Earth would be an ice ball, and there would be no living of anything on the planet. Now, there are so many variables not taken into account that the concept that carbon dioxide emitted by the burning of fossil fuels by humankind has control of the thermostat of the planet is patently absurd. Now, there are dozens of very good, reputable scientists that continue to work trying to find what the impact is. And I can tell you they're working in first hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit, then thousands of degrees, then 10,000s, and then 100,000s, which is to say they're trying to find a number to the right of the decimal place when you come up with a number for the temperature impact, what I call the control of the thermostat, and nobody has been able to do it. So in computer language, we call it a default. When we don't know what's going on, we take a guess, which we call a default number. Well, the default number of man's impact on the temperature of this planet must be 0. But people's careers depend on it. So even the very best people that are not fearful, that are not claiming that the change in temperature of the planet is an existential threat, the people that are really good scientists and they're trying their best still believe there is some impact. I am absolutely convinced man's impact on the temperature of this planet is as close to 0 as anyone can figure. Now I want to list for you some very obvious variables about this Earth and its atmosphere and its sea level that are taken into account in no single mathematical model of the 117 financed by our federal government, and you should be shocked to hear that they're not part of the equation. The first one is clouds. We do not understand the impact of clouds around the Earth on the temperature of the planet. Secondly, none of them consider the seasonal variations in the radiation that comes from the sun. The sun has 11-year cycles that have been going on for 2 centuries that we've been charting them, and the amount of radiation that comes from the sun in these cycles varies. Right now, the amount of radiation is declining, and most serious climate scientists are fairly sure we're not only not warming, within 20 years we will be cooling. We also do not understand the energy flows from the oceans to land, from the oceans to air. We don't understand the impact of vegetation. We don't understand how the role that ice sheets play, or the relationship between ice and sea level and glaciers. We do not understand the role of hurricanes and tornadoes. And we do not understand the tectonic movements at the bottom of the sea. We know things move. Kids used to joke about the fact that if you looked at a map of the Earth, all of the continents looked like at one time they all fit together, and that was considered silly. But in the 1950s, we found out that it was true. All the continents have drifted apart over millions and millions of years. And finally, we know that the core of the Earth, which is essentially molten iron, rotates at a different rate as the crust of the Earth. None of these things are considered in any of the mathematical models supposed to simulate the temperature of this planet. They should be obvious to everybody listening to this webinar that they're important things. But the people who have collected billions of dollars to come up with these equations have no clue how to deal with them So they don't deal with them at all. And they deal only with variables they think they have an idea of, and they put them into these equations and make these absurd predictions that have allowed the fear-mongers all over the world to make absurd claims that man's role of burning fossil fuels and emitting carbon dioxide is an existential threat to the world. It's absurd. And they went far enough a number of years ago to say we have 12 years left and then we're all going to perish. Well, that's stupid. They only
already 5 years are gone.
Now, yeah, it's all insanity. So I'm quite convinced that the best number, the best impact of man on the temperature of the Earth is actually zero. Now, you also asked about sea level. Well, I've been studying sea level at least I'm only 85 years old, but the records, some records go back actually 160 years old, and we have very good sea level records all over the world, and I've given testimony many times about what these records are, and there's simply nowhere on the planet where the sea level has risen more than 7 inches per century, and on the average of all a dozen locations around the world, it would appear that that's the number. We go back 800 years with very good records, and by and large, sea level has been rising for 800 years at a rate of 7 inches per century. However, sea level is a localized situation. It varies from place to place. There are even places where sea level is going down. One of those places is Sitka, Alaska. We know that in recent decades, the sea level in Sitka, Alaska has declined a few inches. Now, we don't know why, we don't understand it, but it just points out the idea of looking at sea level as a single number for the whole planet is crazy in itself. So the entire fear-mongering of our climate, of our global warming, of sea level, is all built for the government to take greater control. If you can control carbon dioxide emissions, you control all energy, and of course they want to do away with fossil fuel. And if they continue to do away with fossil fuels, they will set back society. I'm saying about 150 years. That would be somewhere around the middle of the 19th century. And if you go back and think what life was like and what we could do with technical advances in around 1860, that's where we'd be. Of course, it is never going to happen. They will fail miserably. But along the way, their real goal is to be short of energy, implement the end of fossil fuels. We won't have enough energy to run the world, and they will then be able to ration energy and control society. They aren't going to succeed, but that's the situation. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you for your insightful comments. It's certainly a huge business, this, the climate alarmism that is propping up everything that they're saying. So we did switch the order of the questions slightly. So the next question I'd like to go on to as for Robert Lyman and and Jay Lehr again. We can start with Robert Lyman. So we want to know, what are the consequences of our government's adopting a net zero approach to climate change? However, before going into that, Tom has some slides to explain what they mean by net zero. So if you'd like, you can go ahead and share your screen for that.
Will you go ahead first, Tom?
Yeah, there we go. Okay, can people see that?
Yes, I can see it. You can make it full screen if you'd like, or
this is as big as it'll go in PDF. Yeah, I think it's important to go through some of the steps that have happened with the United Nations so that you understand what the driver of the climate scare is with regards to our government. Back in 1972, the fear was global cooling. And in fact, these two Columbia University climatologists Dr. Kolka and Dr. Matthews, they convinced the US government that climate change and global cooling was a threat. And they actually convened a historic conference called the Present Interglacial. How and when will it end? The interglacial, of course, is the time between glacial periods when, in Canada's case, we were mostly covered with ice. So they wrote a letter to President Nixon, and like many politicians, he immediately responded by creating a panel on the present interglacial, okay, and other government agencies. So that sort of puts things in perspective. That's when the climate scare really started in 1972. Now, by the mid-1970s, many scientists believed that cooling was more likely than warming, or that any other change may happen at all. In fact, Newsweek explained in a direct quote from the National Academy of Sciences, not only are the basic scientific questions largely unanswered, but in many cases, we do not even know enough to pose the questions. So at least in the mid-70s, they were being honest, which is great. He said, yet, and this is typical of what we see in all climate forecasts, it's always catastrophe. This is a continuation of the quote. Yet there is one thing that nearly all experts agree on, news reports explained. As Time put it, the world's prolonged streak of exceptionally good climate has probably come to an end, meaning that mankind will find it harder to grow food. Okay, so this is something that the British writer Tom Stacey, he calls this catastrophilia, or catastrophiliac, if that's what you are. And that's something that we see a constant wide-eyed summons to action, okay? They're always saying something to that extent, that it's always the end of the world, and nothing's come true so far. In fact, Tim Ball says that every climate forecast they've made to date has been wrong. Now, by 1981, the narrative was starting to change. Both NASA and Kolka found that warming was more likely. Interestingly, Kolka said it was a precursor to a glacial. I can't figure that one out. The New York Times was skeptical. And again, it was great that the media were in those times skeptical. They said, but it has been hard to find any practical evidence of this greenhouse effect. Indeed, average surface air temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere have dropped in the last few decades. However, 1988 rolled around. In June, it was an unusually hot summer. And James Hansen, who was a fairly junior scientist at NASA, a bit of an outrigger, he was not agreeing with most of the others, and he appeared before Senators Gore and Wirth in a Senate hearing. And here's what Senator Wirth said to PBS Frontline. He admitted in 2007 that they stage managed the hearing. He said, we went in the night before and opened all the windows. And remember, this was a very hot day. If you actually look back at the previous graph, you see here that was a hot time and, in fact, a very hot day. So the air conditioner wasn't working. So when the hearing occurred, it was really hot. And they actually scheduled that because they found that in Washington, D.C., historically, that was the hottest day of the year. So they compounded it by stage managing it so that everybody would see the scientist sweating while he was making these comments. And he said, here's then what Hansen said. I said that I was 99% confident that the world really was getting warmer and that there was a high degree of probability that was due to human-made greenhouse gases. Now, it's interesting that the other people in NASA did not agree with them, and they were pretty upset. But regardless, as a result of this hearing, the UN got moving. And the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Program, they established the IPCC. Okay, now this was the purpose of it. It was not specifically biased at the beginning. It was to assess scientific, technological, and socioeconomic information relating to climate change. So that was pretty good at the beginning. However, the trouble was it was composed of UN nominees, mainly government employees or recipients of government finance who would agree with the UN's position. So it's a bit of a self-reinforcing circumstance. And they released their first report in 1990. They concluded that global temperatures could increase by 0.3 degrees C if CO2 levels were not reduced. Now, the interesting thing that happened next was that in 1992, and this is the real origin of where the climate scare problems got out of hand, in 1992, something called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was actually a treaty, the Global Warming Treaty. It was signed at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro by Brian Mulroney, then President Bush. It didn't have any binding greenhouse gas reduction targets, but they were going to make protocols and other agreements based on it later. Now, here's the primary objective of the Unfccc, and this is where, as I say, the problem starts. The ultimate objective of this convention is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. The thing is, of course, they didn't know that there was any, so they were trying to do something that, as Jay pointed out, isn't really possible. But regardless, that was their objective. Now, this is very critical for everybody on the call to know about. Article 4, paragraph 7, said this, and this is super important. Of everything I say today, this is the most important thing. And remember, Canada signed this. It's a treaty. We are bound by it. The extent to which developing country parties, and China, by the way, in 1992 was classified as a developing country party. They had no billionaires in 1992. They have hundreds of them now. But regardless, they are still classified as a developing country. And they were quizzed about whether they would take that status away from them, and China doesn't want that. And you can see why in a second. The extent to which developing country parties will effectively implement their commitments under the convention will depend on the effective implementation by developed country parties of their commitments under the convention related to financial resources and transfer of technology, and will take fully into account, here's the key word, economic and social development and poverty eradication are the first and overriding priorities of developing countries, not greenhouse gas emissions. They want to have poverty alleviation and development as their primary priorities. So in other words, China's effectively saying this: give us the money. Now it's being set up to be $100 billion per year green fund that we would have to pay, and we'll make greenhouse gas intensity cuts. They're not even promising at this point to make real cuts. They're promising to make intensity cuts. In other words, cuts per amount of output of product, unless it interferes with our first and over priorities, which of course it would. So maybe we won't make the reductions, and built into this is the fact that we can't look. Again, this is the most key point of everything I'm saying. So even if you believe the climate scare, China, who's putting out twice as much as the United States, has an out clause. Not only do we have to give them the money, we have to give them the technology, but they may not make the cuts if it interferes with their first and overriding priorities, which of course it would, because coal is their least expensive and most bountiful energy source for electricity. And so they're going to simply say, well, we can't cut this because we're involved in social development and poverty eradication. So we're not going to make the cuts. So even though the Paris Agreement has 2030 as the time at which China is supposed to stabilize their emissions, I don't think they're even going to do it then, because they have an out clause right here. When they were confronted in Peru in 2014 about this, about whether they would change the Framework Convention on Climate Change with regards to their out clause, the Chinese negotiator, he said this, quote, he said, "Our purpose is to enforce the Framework Convention. That's the purpose of Paris, not to change it." So China knows they have a sweetheart deal, and even if you think we are causing dangerous climate change, which I don't, but even if you did, China has no obligation to reduce emissions. So Canada, at 1.6% of world emissions, it's not going to have any effect at all with countries like China doing whatever they want. Now here, just a few more dates before I turn the lectern back over to Mary Jean. Unfccc, the Framework Convention, came into force in '94. And what you're going to hear often over the next little while, especially coming up to the meetings in Scotland, is this COP. It's in red here, Conference of the Parties. This is the supreme body of the FCCC treaty. It's the highest decision-making authority related to the fulfillment. And COP is an association of all the countries that have agreed to the convention, which includes Canada, the United States, etc. And by the way, the United States, when they agreed to the Framework Convention, they agreed to it, and this was that in fact any future limitations had to be associated, had to be approved by the Senate. So there was no way that Obama should have approved Paris. Here's just a sample of what the COPs are. We're coming up to a COP in Scotland, as I say, which if you count the numbers up, it's COP 28 or something. And you'll hear this often, the different COP meetings. I went to a couple of these, the ones that are in red, the COP in Copenhagen and Paris. And they're pretty amazing. You know, the meeting in Copenhagen was the largest meeting of world leaders in world history. It was bigger even than World War II meetings. And so it was kind of ironic that they had 30,000 people coming to the meeting, most of them flying in, using incredible amounts of fossil fuels, of course, and huge greenhouse gas emissions to talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it was kind of ironic that this would be the biggest meeting in world history, talking about something that they were actually doing the opposite to. Now, the IPCC assessment reports are interesting. They're worth talking about briefly. Here's the third assessment report. The fact, and this is one of the conclusions you almost never hear, and this is why I'm going to tell you in a minute why. The fact that global mean temperature has increased since the late 19th century and that other trends have been observed does not necessarily mean that an anthropogenic effect on the climate has been identified. Climate has always varied on all time scales, so the observed change may be natural. Now, that's not what you hear in the press, of course. But so I'll get to that in a second. I'll just skip this slide. But here's why. The statement that's made, we always attribute it, like this is the most recent one, the second most recent one, the fourth assessment report. They're saying greenhouse gas forcing has very likely caused most of the observed warming. Now, we're led to believe that this statement is strongly supported by 2,500 scientists. Now, let's take a look and see if that's actually true, because the media is going to tell us continuously that these statements are agreed to by large numbers of scientists. Well, the working group, there are 3 working groups. Most of the participants are in working groups 2 and 3, and those are not actually involved in understanding the causes of climate change. They assume that working group 1 is correct. Now, working groups, as I say, are mostly UN employees, mainly government employees who agree with the UN's position. So the question is, but don't hundreds of independent expert reviewers study the draft and provide extensive feedback to the editing teams who then incorporate their comments into the report? Well, that's what we're led to believe. But no, that's an illusion. John McLean, who's one of the ICSC Canada directors, he's a leading climate data analyst in Melbourne, Australia. And he found, for example, in the particular working group that he was looking at, of the 600 scientists involved in working group 1, which remember looks at the causes of climate change, 308 were official IPCC expert reviewers who commented on the final draft. Of these, just 5 reviewers commented on 11 chapters of that report, on all 11 chapters. And so here's what we really have. We're told that hundreds of scientists all agree with the report. But as you can see, only a few of the chapters were actually reviewed by very many of them. In some cases, there was only 5. Only 5 reviewers actually commented on all the chapters of the report. And it's interesting. Here's a further breakdown. Only 62 reviewers gave any comments at all on the crucial chapter 9, which I don't have time to get into, but that's one of the most critical chapters. 55 of them had serious vested interests in that they were editors, authors of the reports that they were supposedly commenting on. Of the remaining 7 independent reviewers who commented chapter 9, 5 made 1 comment on the entire chapter, and only one, okay, not 2,500, but 1 explicitly endorsed the most significant statement of the chapter in the whole UN report. And how did they handle feedback? Well, they just rejected a lot of the feedback. In fact, I've heard, and Madhav can probably expand on this, that there are a number of expert reviewers who withdrew from the process because, as you can see, a very high percentage of the second order review, which is where they give their input and they're supposed to be taken seriously and incorporated somehow into the final report, you see how many of their comments were just rejected out of hand, almost 2/3 of them for chapter 9, which is the key chapter.
That's correct.
So I'll just skip over. It's taking a little longer than I thought. So what we're finding then is that what the media and government pay attention to is something called the summary for policymakers. They don't look at the underlying reports, partly because they don't understand them and they're so huge. Now, here's some problems with that. The vast majority of scientists who write the main science report do not see the summary of their work before the public sees it. And in some cases, they disagree with the summary of their report, if you can believe that, okay? And in fact, here's the thing, which is really the smoking gun, where you know it's driven by politics. The summary of the policymaker is published months before the science report. And here's exactly what they say in the IPCC procedures. Changes to the main science reports shall, now look, we're not talking about changes to the summary. They're saying changes to the main science report shall be those necessary to ensure consistency with the summary for policymakers. In other words, the summary for policymakers is the determinant as to what actually goes in the science, where you'd think it would be completely the other way around. So the process is quite corrupt. Now, the Copenhagen Accord, 2009, it's interesting. They're saying, you know, we're going to control the world's climate. And this is the much mocked King Canute clause, because you remember King Canute was going to stop the waves. Now, one last thing I wanted to talk about, and this is not given much coverage, it's something in COP18. It was agreed to in the Doha Climate Gateway. And it's actually the Trojan horse in all of the climate scare thing. What it is this? The Trojan horse in COP18, and it's still COP18, and it's still in effect. It's something called loss and damages. The New Scientist magazine sums it up as follows. Developing countries won a promise from developed ones that they would compensate them for losses and damages caused by climate change. And this is the loss and damage section, which is still in force. What it really means is that these developing countries would actually be subsidized, would actually be funded when typhoons and other major events occurred, because we supposedly caused them. And the interesting thing is that there is no understanding as to whether this would be retroactive to events that happened many times in the past. So indeed, we could be held accountable to pay for Hurricane Haiyan that occurred a long time ago. Anyway, here we go. So Paris, which is the thing that's in force right now, Canada promised to reduce our greenhouse gases by 30% from 2005 by 2030. We haven't hit any of our targets. We've had about 5 of them, and we haven't hit any. We've now brought in something called carbon pricing across the country. And if the provinces don't bring it in, then the feds are going to force it on us. Now, I'll just finish off here just with a couple of things. The interesting thing is that some people are saying that the targets that we have under Paris are not sufficiently solid. They're not actually forced by law. And so the government are actually bringing in laws. They're trying to make all these things enforced by law. The other thing that they're doing is Trudeau has announced net zero by 2050. And we have to ask, what does that mean? Well, it is interesting that the environmental groups, some of them, like Friends of the Earth, are very much against the net zero target, partly because it's so far off in the future, but also because the meaning of net zero, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I'll just define it right now so we can skip that when it comes up. The meaning of net zero is that it's not just that we reduce our greenhouse gases to zero. They're not saying that. What they're saying is that when you balance the amount of greenhouse gases we're removing from the atmosphere through human action, like planting trees or actually having huge machines to take CO2 out of the air, which I must say is quite dangerous. But regardless, when you actually balance the two, our emissions and our extraction of CO2 would balance. There would be a net zero emission. Now, the environmentalists hate that because they say that, well, in many cases, these schemes for taking CO2 out of the air may not work. They may be put off a long time into the future. And so real greenhouse gas reductions may not really very significantly occur. My concern is that if we take CO2 out of the air artificially, and if, as Dr. Lehr was saying, we're headed for global cooling, we could trip ourselves into the next glacial. And so the whole concept of playing God with nature, taking CO2 out of the air as if we are the master controllers of the climate, that is a very dangerous thing to do. Bill Gates is doing he's pushing a similar project, which is actually putting soot and aerosol particles into clouds. They're not soot, they're aerosols, to purposely reflect sunlight from clouds, make them more reflective, and thereby lower the temperature of the Earth. Again, it's very much like giving a 5-year-old a toolkit and taking the back off your television and asking them to fix it. They have no clue as to how it works. They're likely to electrocute themselves and certainly not fix your TV. So these kinds of geoengineering schemes, taking CO2 out of the air, making our clouds very different and more reflective, this is very dangerous, but they're very serious about it and they're pushing it quite hard. The last thing I wanted to say was this, and that is that some people point out that, oh, well, how could we lose by reducing pollution? Well, the focus of CO2 emission control is not surprisingly, CO2. And carbon dioxide is not pollution. And the EPA's data shows that reducing CO2 is a terrible way to reduce pollution. In fact, they found that the total of 6 principal air pollutants declined since 1980, even though CO2 emissions went up. So the connection between the two is not there. We can reduce pollution. We should reduce pollution in areas where it's a problem. But trying to reduce pollution by reducing CO2, like that really doesn't make any sense. And as you can see here in the US, they specifically showed that even though CO2 went up, they were able to pull pollution down. So, you know, once again, our group ICSC stands for sensible reductions in air pollution where it's a problem, but not through doing CO2. So that's the driver behind our government's trying to make it legally binding that we reduce CO2 and that, you know, the net zero thing become also legally binding. So that's it. Over to you, Mary Jean.
Mary Jean, I say something before. This is Dr. Lehr. I would like to say something before we go on to the next session. What I just heard from Tom Harris is the very best lecture on climate change I have ever heard, and I hope it has been recorded and can be sent around and used, because Tom nailed every single aspect of the problem, and it adds up to the fact that the population of this earth is being subject to the greatest fraud in the history of mankind, and he laid it out with evidence after evidence after evidence. And if that lecture can be captured and sent to wider audiences than we have today, the world will benefit from it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay.
Yeah, thanks so much. So so this was a really great introduction as well about what this whole net zero approach is. So I'd like to ask Bob Lyman if you could talk about what are some of the consequences of governments adopting net zero net zero approach to climate change in Canada, and then we can have Jay Lehr talk about some of the consequences we're seeing in the US.
Thanks, Mary Jean. First, I want to connect to what Tom said, and I hope I could be heard clearly. Also, I want to thank everyone who's listening in. It's very important to have a public dialogue on climate issues that is not ideologically driven. You know, it's driven essentially by people's desire to understand more. And I hope that what we provide you today will help that understanding and encourage more candid and free discussion on it. To go back to one key point that Tom made, the agreement that was reached at COP 21 in Paris in 2015 was not an agreement that created very many legal obligations. In fact, there were only 2 legal obligations. One was to provide reports every 5 years on the emissions plans, emission reduction plans that countries had to commit themselves to politically. And the other was to provide funds to this Green Climate Fund, $100 billion per year that Tom referred to. That's it. There were no other commitments. And those commitments are not legally enforceable. So what is being done in all countries, including Canada, is purely the result of a political decision. Now, people talk a lot about emissions, or GHGs. In my experience, most people in the public don't really understand what tons of carbon dioxide equivalent mean. I'm not sure I can even properly define it. But what it really means is a reduction in the production and use of fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal. Right now, those three energy sources account for 84% of the world's energy needs. 84%. Most of the rest is accounted for by hydroelectricity or nuclear power and a few other things. Renewables that get an enormous amount of attention provide 5%. The net zero target is really about taking that 5% and making it 100%, and doing that, frankly, in a relatively short period of time. The targets differ from country to country, but anywhere from 2035 to 2050, try to completely transform and revolutionize the way in which all of us use energy. So the question is, what is that going to cost? As an economist, I'm delighted that people ask that question, because it very rarely is asked about the climate issue. Most of the time, when I was working in the federal government, and we were working on developing alternatives for the government to follow, we adopted that approach. We tried to assess what are the costs, what are the benefits in terms of reduced emissions and other factors. The government has not done that for about 20 years. There are about 300 programs that are currently in place at the federal and provincial government level in Canada to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There has never been an assessment of the costs and benefits of that package of measures. There has never been an assessment of the cost effectiveness of those measures. There has never been an assessment of the extent to which the various measures that have been undertaken by the federal and provincial governments, and increasingly by municipal governments, duplicate one another or overlap with one another. They simply are not assessing that. And you might say, well, why? Well, the answer is usually, doesn't matter what it costs if you're saving the planet. That's basically the attitude that's being taken. But there are significant costs. And in the short time that we've got here, I can't possibly cover them all, but I'm going to try to give you the flavor of some of the costs that have been incurred specifically in Canada. There are first the direct costs of the government measures, that is the taxes payers' costs. Much of them involve subsidies to renewable energy. I did a study of this. I calculated 24 different generic subsidies that are provided to wind, solar, and biomass industries in Canada. 24 different generic types. They are not quantified, so it's impossible to say exactly what it costs, but it most certainly is in the billions of dollars. There are also subsidies, of course, to electric vehicles. The federal government provides a $5,000 per vehicle subsidy for the purchase of an EV. And if you live in Quebec, they top that up with an additional $8,000. And most of those subsidies tend to go to wealthier car buyers because electric vehicles tend to be purchased as second vehicles. There is over the various measures, those 300 measures that I've talked about, while uncosted, almost certainly cost over $5 billion per year and rising. Beyond the direct cost to taxpayers, there's a direct cost to you, to consumers. The most obvious one, and the one that tends to get the most attention, of course, are carbon dioxide taxes. This year, with the carbon dioxide tax set at $40 per ton, the revenues that will be received by governments will be of the order of $6.6 billion. And that tax rate is increasing up to $170 per ton by 2030. By that time, the annual revenues that will be received by governments will be $28 billion in Canada. Now, in part, it's returned to ratepayers, but it's not returned entirely to ratepayers. In fact, in Quebec, it's not returned to the taxpayers at all, and only partially returned in British Columbia. And over time, it's virtually certain that as the amounts of revenue increase, governments will find a way to retain a larger and larger portion of those revenues. In addition to the taxes on carbon dioxide, there is GST on those taxes. So a tax on a tax, and that amounts to over $100 million a year. the other significant cost that has occurred has been the increased cost of electricity rates in those provinces that have reduced coal use and mandated a transition to increased use of renewable energy fuel. Electricity rates in Ontario basically doubled over the past decade, and they will shortly in Alberta and Saskatchewan. There are the costs of meeting regulatory standards, like the requirement to limit vehicle emissions, to improve appliance efficiency. And there is coming an increase in the stringency of the National Building Code, come into effect by 2030. It will be a net zero code, which some estimate will add $100,000 to the cost of building a new house in Canada. There are the indirect costs to consumers. Basically, because of all those taxes, the prices of all goods and services that require energy for the production and transportation will go up. The carbon dioxide tax is imposed at $40 per ton in Canada. In our principal competitors, the United States, Mexico, and China, it's $3 a ton or less. This is putting our companies at a significant competitive disadvantage, and a major cost to Canada will be the loss of activity by those companies. I want to talk about one other major, what I call foregone revenues, which is the cost to Canadian oil and gas producers mainly for the loss of market access because of the restrictions on pipeline expansion. That totaled $16 billion in 2018 alone. There have also been almost 20 major oil and gas and mining projects canceled in the course of the period since 2014 at a foregone investment of over $200 billion for Canada. And those continue. Ultimately, however, some of the greatest costs are non-financial in nature. Canadians are being told which energy sources they can use, which they can't, which standards they have to meet, which things they can't use. It's having an enormous adverse effect upon people in the Western provinces, because Alberta and Saskatchewan alone represent almost 50% of Canada's emissions. The effort to significantly reduce, and ultimately eliminate those emissions will hit those provinces in a devastating way. And it may very well be that the worst cost to us is the cost of losing those provinces to Confederation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Certainly huge costs, and people aren't asking those key questions, which is certainly a problem. So I'd like to pose the same question to Jay Lehr. If you could talk a bit about the same situation in the US. What are the costs that we're seeing for trying to have a net zero approach to climate change?
Are you asking that question to me, Mary?
Oh, to Jay.
Oh, to Jay. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Let me address it. It will destroy the economy of the United States, which is actually the intent. Let me explain. In the United States, the current administration and everyone behind them, their goal is to eliminate fossil fuels. And just as Mr. Lyman said, they want to move renewables, wind and solar, from 5% to 100%. Now, it cannot be done. Most everything that you hear from the alarmists that were mentioned by Bob and Tom are impossible. Physically impossible. These things can never happen. Well, you'd think, well, then what are we worried about? Well, along the way in trying to reduce fossil fuels and increase wind and solar, there are tremendous costs, and more importantly, there are tremendous reductions in available energy. The administration in the United States is totally aware of that, and that is frankly their goal. They know you cannot replace fossil fuels with wind and solar. So as they move down the path, the available energy on every electric grid. We have 3 grids in the United States, on the East Coast, the West Coast, and Texas. The freeze that occurred in Texas in February came very close to destroying the entire grid, in which tens of thousands of lives would have been lost. And the primary reason for the disaster was the dependency of wind and solar in Texas, which is totally undependable. I mean, everybody knows when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, it's of no value. So you have to have backup of fossil fuel 100%. And they didn't. And the freezing temperatures required the use of more energy than they were available. So what they do is they take people offline. They were within 4 minutes of the grid being destroyed because the amount of energy that goes in must equal the amount coming out. There can't be a discrepancy. And when they didn't have enough energy for the whole grid, they have contracts with big companies to cut them off to get the load down. And they were within 4 minutes of being unable to do that. So the government really knows what the problem is. And I mentioned it in my first commentary. Their goal is for the government of the United States to be the purveyor of all energy, which means rationing. They will decide who gets what energy because it will not any longer be available in the huge quantities that it currently is in this country. And if you control the energy required by every business, every industry, every home, you really have enslaved the entire population. It sounds dramatic. It sounds drastic, but it is true. I'm not horribly worried about it because I know they'll fail along the way, and I give this administration essentially just 18 more months. Our next election cycle is in 2022, and the country is waking up to what terrible things they're doing on a daily basis. And the Congress, which currently supports the presidential administration, Mr. Biden and his friends, will shift. Both the House and the Senate will shift to the Republican side. That will leave the Biden administration in power for another 2 years, but with very diminished power, because if you don't have the Congress behind you, you can't get all the terrible things done that they're doing basically on a daily basis. And what they are doing is they are creating a platform for every congressman, every Republican congressman to run on in November of 2022 and point out to the public what is going on, how their rights have been diminished, how their costs of everything are going up. And I think there is little doubt, I'd say there's no doubt, that the House of Representatives will shift back to the Republicans. Currently, the Democrats only have a 4-seat majority, and I'm almost as confident that the Senate will shift as well. But those are the real things they're aiming at, is the rationing of energy. They know full well they cannot fulfill what they're telling the public they're planning to do.
Great, thank you so much, Jay. So I'm just going to switch up the question order a little bit from what we had originally. I'd like to go on to Madhav Kandikar and ask, what can we do to prepare for extreme weather events and climate change? So regardless of whether we cause climate change or not, which we really don't, what can we do to prepare and be ready for these events?
Oh, we can't hear you, Madhav. Still can't hear you.
You have to unmute. Please unmute.
Hit the microphone at the bottom of the screen.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, yes.
Okay. Extreme weather doesn't come out of the sky just like that. You can identify the oncoming extreme weather event. Let me give you one example. An oncoming heat wave, for example. Now, for the last few days, in southern Ontario, the meteorologists have been telling us, oh, we are going to get a heat wave. Okay, the definition of heat wave in Ontario or in Canada is rather picky. I lived in central India when summer temperatures or pre-monsoon temperatures would be as high as 43 or 45 degrees Celsius, but I never felt that way. Now here, as soon as the temperature goes about 30 or 31 degrees, we start calling heat waves. Okay, no matter. What I'm trying to say is that you can say ahead of time, at least 3 to 4 days ahead of time, that we may be getting a significant hot weather event over the next few days. We can prepare for it. For example, if you have air conditioning, make sure it is working fine. If many people who don't have air conditioning, if there are community centers where air conditioning is available, make people aware of those, and those who do not have air conditioning, encourage them or their families to move into these community centers, especially during very hot afternoon or during hot nights. This is one example. Let me give another example of, say, drought. We know in Canada, the prairie provinces are prone to droughts. If you recall, in 2002 or 3, when drought was becoming quite severe, the then Premier of Alberta, who is gone now, Ralph Klein, he said, well, you know, climate has been changing for a million years. Just by signing to CO2 accord, drought is not going to go away. Anyway, I think he was right in some sense, but people blamed him, and a lot of people wrote letters urging Klein to sign on to the what was then known as a Kyoto Accord. Okay, coming back to the point. Myself and a couple of colleagues in Winnipeg, one particular name I like to mention is Ray Garnett, who is an agroclimate expert in Winnipeg. He worked for many years with the Canadian Wheat Board. Ray and I, we have developed some simple indices that will allow us to tell ahead of time, sometimes as much as 2 to 3 months ahead of time, whether we are going to get a very severe drought on the prairies in the coming month. And these and many other indices are available to us now. So what I'm saying is that we can prepare ourselves for these oncoming events of extreme heat, extreme drought, and so on. Now let me end on another issue. For all these years, we have been talking about extreme heat, extreme drought, extreme rain events, and so on. But we never talked about extreme cold. Why not? And if you look at past 5 years, we had some extreme cold events. Just a year and a half ago, or about March 1920, St. John's, Newfoundland, 75 centimeters of snow, and entire island was cut off from the rest of the world for 2 whole days. Nobody was able to do anything at all. Why is this happening? Such heavy snow events are becoming more and more and more common. Just this year, in the early January, Spain had the huge snowfall. Followed that with cold UK. Most of January of 2021 was very cold in UK. Then come April, which was one of the coldest April in Europe. So what is happening? What I'm trying to say here is that just like extreme heat, we are now entering perhaps a season of extreme cold. If so, should we not be preparing ourselves for that? should we not be making sure that we have enough energy, our houses are well secured, well supplied with heat and all that? So what I'm trying to say is that extreme weather events on both sides of the temperature scale must be looked at. And we are possibly entering into a cold, extreme climate period in the next few years. That is my personal view, but I may be wrong, I may be right. The time only will tell.
Yeah, Madhav, or I should say, Mary Jean, can I just add something to that on the snow?
Sure. Yes, go on.
Yeah, sure. A couple of years ago, there was a meeting held at the Aviation Museum here in Canada, and they were lamenting the end of snow in Canada. So before I went to the meeting, I looked up to see how much snow cover was changing over North America, and it was actually rising over the decades.
That's correct.
Right. So I went to the microphone in front of the 300 people or so, and I said, you realize, of course, that while if we did lose snow, it would be very bad for you skiers who are on the stage, but it doesn't appear to be happening at this point. In fact, the snow cover is gradually rising over the decades. And the audience were furious with me. Some of them stood up and shook their fists and they said, go home. And I said, well, check the data yourself. And you know, it's interesting that the other day I was watching a debate between James Taylor from the Heartland Institute and a couple of climate activists. And James was showing systematically how each of their claims were totally wrong. I mean, the evidence was not there. And yet they still continued to say these very emotional storytelling type approaches. And Mary Jean and I are actually reading a book right now called Cynical Theories. And it talks about how today's world is largely being influenced by something called postmodern philosophy. It really started in the 1940s as in art and eventually took over in the social sciences in the universities in the 60s and 70s. And it's now starting to appear in our society. And these people reject the use of scientific evidence to come to conclusions. They even reject the use of evidence in legal systems of justice. They want to reject all of the normal classical liberal approach to rational, evidence-based decision-making based on an open and welcoming approach to alternative points of view where you try to come with the best compromise. They reject all of that. And I'm going to put a link to the book that Mary Jean and I are actually reading in the chats here, because these two British researchers actually look at the origin of much of today's woke mentality that promotes a climate narrative above the evidence. In other words, the evidence doesn't matter. It's
That's right.
Yeah, it's their feelings their feelings and the storytelling. And in fact, I think what's happening here is many of these young environmentalists came up through a system in university which was largely based on the postmodern philosophy where evidence doesn't matter. It's based on feelings and storytelling as to what is considered correct. And the nice thing about this book, and we haven't come to this part yet, but after they explain the origin of this basically evidenceless thinking and the kind of policies they want to formulate, which are not based on real world evidence at all, how you fight back against that, how you answer that, that's supposed to be addressed later in the book. I'm listening to it on Audible right now, and I'll just put the link in the question period here, because I think that is the origin of many of these really ludicrous environmental and energy policies, and the drivers behind it are in fact a fundamental non-liberal, it's against classical liberalism, it's against the Enlightenment, it's against the use of evidence to make decisions. And it's very destructive, and it's something we have to fight back against, not just in climate, but in all sorts of areas. So I'll put up the link and turn it back to you, Mary Jean.
Thank you.
All right, great, thank you. So I think that now it's actually a good time for us to go into some audience questions to make sure that we have enough time to address those. So I have a question queue here. So our first person who has a question is Isabella Popova. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Would you like to turn your microphone on and ask your question, or I can ask it for you? So if Isabella is still there, you're welcome to go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. It's very refreshing to actually hear from others in the field who are speaking up about the climate change narrative. So as a professional in the environmental field, I've seen my colleagues basically dismiss any contradictory information, and I'm trying to figure out what do we do, because the environmental field has been hijacked, and I'm debating, do I leave the field entirely or do I pursue other angles? Because this climate change narrative, like you explained, seeks to control resources and seeks to control people and the population, while using CO2 as the scapegoat and justifying polluting the environment in other ways.
I have a very quick answer, and that is take a look at the book I just put up, because they actually will address how to handle those kinds of objections. But I'll pass it over to the others for a more in-depth answer.
Well, maybe I could just make one comment. Never forget the possibility of a single individual making a difference.
I agree.
I worked in the Canadian federal government for 37 years, and I was very much involved in advising ministers. And believe me, in what I would call the good old days, analysis counted for a great deal. Evaluation of costs and benefits, setting out of options counted for a great deal. And that was the role of the public service. But at the end of the day, ministers make decisions on the basis of political feedback that they get from the public. And it's important for all parts of the public to participate in that. You may be able to do so within your own group, within your own company, or within your own family. But remember, there are also opportunities to be involved in political parties, and if you wish to, you can actually apply to give testimony before a parliamentary committee. So don't give up. There are ways to be successful if you wish to engage.
Well, I work at one of the major financial institutions in the environmental department, and they're all about pushing the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which we know what they're about. So I've managed to stay away from that because I have concerns. But at the corporate level, this is what they're all about now. And then you look at the NGOs, and they're still pushing the climate change narrative as well. And the political parties themselves their platforms are based on how they plan to meet those goals.
Well, you're exactly right, and you paint what is certainly a depressing picture. You're paddling upstream at all times, but in the history of the world, most great advances were not done by teams or organizations, but by individuals that fought against constant derision of their points of view. I would suggest not leaving the field. I would suggest that, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. And if you can recruit people to your point of view at a dinner, at a social event, or a sporting event, really one by one, what you've described, you're aware you're not going to make a dent with the NGOs or the government itself, or maybe your own office, but you can change the minds of individuals if you go about it in a very calm way, just laying out the factual material. The media is against us all. They are a wholly subsidiary of the left, certainly in Canada as well in the United States. And I've been paddling uphill all my career, essentially, and I've made a lot of headway and working in a lot of different areas in a career that's now over 60 years working in the environment. And I take my pleasure in knowing that I've altered the minds and put a number of people, a significant number of people, on the right path And it's kind of all you can do. You're not going to be able to move a mountain. You can move a molehill. I don't think I'm boring, but wherever I am among people, I will be talking about these scientific issues that are so misunderstood, and sometimes people will tease me, there he goes again, sort of thing. But I make a headway, and you've got to be satisfied with small victories. But, that's what we have to do. We will win. I mean, this whole leftist thing will end. It has to end because everything I described earlier about the failure of all their intent will happen. And what we hope is that as they fail, the cost to humanity will not be too great. And as I pointed out, I'm optimistic that it's going to begin to turn in the next election cycle just 18 months from now in November of 2022.
Great. Thank you for your advice. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're muted, Mary Jane.
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much for your question. So next in the question queue, we have Sadaf Galani. So if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Mary Jane. Good evening, everyone. I'm blown away by this stellar panel. As Dr. Lehr said, every Canadian needs to see this recording. I'm going to talk to Joseph after, and I'm hoping that we can widely circulate this recording. I have a few comments and questions, and I'm hoping that kind of like a free approach, anyone who wishes to answer can. I'm not a climate scientist. What I found over the years is that this is definitely a religion, and that made me suspicious when we're being told that the science is settled, right? There you go. Exactly. So what really pains me is how it has co-opted every level of academia, right? So when my son was in high school, a good portion of the science curriculum was discussion of this, and it was taught very much like a religion. You couldn't question it, and then when Greta came to Canada a few years ago, I believe we had record numbers of university students attend that march. I see it as a brilliant eugenics scheme, because ultimately the message to this younger generation is that human beings are a cancer on the planet, right? What you're entailing, and therefore it took away from any momentum for an anti-war or anti-poverty movement, because psychologically, this is the planet correcting itself. And when COVID started, this was the rhetoric we were hearing from the World Economic Forum. Like Prince Charles said that, Mother Earth's lungs also need to breathe. And I predicted last year that we're going to see this unholy marriage between COVID and climate change. And I consider climate change to be COVID's older and uglier brother. And it's going to come back, and they're going to tell us that, first they're bankrupting us, but then they're going to shrug their shoulders and say, the way we were living was not sustainable anyways. So what I wanted to ask the esteemed panel is, what do you think about Maurice Strong and all of this? My understanding is, like, when he was in the Earth Summit back in the 90s, he said that the middle class is not sustainable. Our SUVs, our meat eating, our air conditioners. And I believe he lived in China for a few years to help set up that control grid, that scientific, dictatorship that they're bringing here now to our parts of the world. So I was wondering if you have any comments about Maurice Strong, and definitely what do you see happening now on the horizon as this is going to come back to the fore now? They're going to bring this back. The whisperings are there, but it's going to become more prominent, this global warming narrative, and they're going to merge it with COVID.
Let me jump in. First of all, let me say that every word you have just spoken makes for a tremendous contribution to this entire program if we can get it recorded and spread widely, because everything you said is precisely right. I'll start with unquestionably, environmentalism has been a religion now for 40 years. And that's very difficult to battle, because people do not have physical evidence for the support of all the terrible things they say man is doing to the environment. They have faith in it. Now on to Maurice Strong. I considered Maurice Strong the most evil human being that has lived in my lifetime until George Soros came along to basically support all the terrible things that are going on in the United States. I'm not sure that he isn't the primary puppeteer of President Biden, who certainly has little to do with what's going on. But Maurice Strong really got it going. He was a billionaire Canadian who decided that he really wanted to run the world. And the problem we have, the primary movers in this country are all the billionaires, the people that own Google and own Amazon and Bill Gates. When you have that kind of money and you have all that money can buy, the only thing you don't have is power to run the world. And that's why every one of them, after they've made their billions in the capitalist way, want to run the world. It's a very sad situation. But I think it would be easy to say that 70% of the richest people in the United States want to now defeat capitalism, install socialism. Because in a socialist or communist state, the rich people can run the world. You can't do it in capital. You can't buy the power in a capitalist system, but you can do it in a socialist communist system. And Maurice Strong was the first in my lifetime, and I gather in your lifetime as well. I've been a student, I've studied all of it, and essentially George Soros has picked up where he left off when he passed away, and I now consider George Soros the most evil person on the planet. But again, it's kind of similar to the answer I had to the previous question. You really can only do it one at a time. They are so powerful. It's been going on now more than 40 years. I worked with the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States in the 70s, and I helped to write 70 pieces of legislation to protect our air, our water, our waste disposal, our farming, and our mining, and these were terrific laws. And the left figured out in 1980 that the Environmental Protection Agency could be taken over. And so it really started in 1980. It's been going on for 40 years. And as you pointed out, they've infiltrated all of our schools, all of our academia, and certainly every aspect of the government. Mr. Trump tried to do a great job for the United States, and he did do a great job, but he was quite limited by what is called the deep state, which is the same people you point out infiltrated academia. They've infiltrated the entire government. But we're going to win, and I actually was not disappointed that Biden stole the election, because what I knew they would do would begin to dig a hole so deep that the average American citizen would recognize we've got to get rid of these people before they destroy the nation. And I think that will begin in 18 months. I don't think you've reached that in Canada yet. Things are really worse in Canada than they are in the United States, and you haven't really started the road back. But I think we have started the road back in the United States.
I'd just like to make one kind of comment here. This issue is kind of like an irresistible force meeting an immovable object, because while I do not disagree at all with the strength of the environmental movement and the religious commitment of Western people, Western media, Western governments to it, that is not being mirrored in the developing countries. 2/3 of the emissions in the world come from non-OECD countries, and those are constantly growing. People talk about us going through this inevitable and massive energy transition. What they forget is that this year, worldwide oil demand is growing by 5.4 million barrels a day. And by the end of next year, we will be up to over 100 million barrels a day, the same as we were before the COVID. The world needs energy. The developing countries are not going to be stopped in terms of their desire for increased standards of living, increased incomes for their families, because a group of environmental groups in Canada, the United States, and Europe say that they don't want that to happen. So, I mean, the reality is that we're not going to see remarkably higher temperatures. We're not going to see the extreme weather that people keep talking about. We are going to see significantly increasing carbon dioxide emissions related to economic development. And it will be very interesting to see what's the resolution of those competing forces.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something quickly. There is another book that is worth people looking at. I think one of the keys to fighting back is understanding how what happened happened. And as I just put up, I said this book explains how the extreme left took over our society. And there's an Audible book there. It's well worth the time to listen to because it also is the key to fighting back.
Let me make one more comment. I think if you see in the last, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me all? Okay. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, a well-known professor at New York University, Professor Steve Koonin, who was Undersecretary under Obama administration on energy. He has come up with a book, Unsettled, What the Climate Does, What It Doesn't. His book has been well received in the climate science community, particularly in the community in our own viewpoint, because he expresses our own viewpoint that the climate science is not settled. The issue is still very much being debated, and I think the climate science needs to be looked into with a different perspective. Interestingly enough, some of the climate modelers were very upset by his book. And at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, I think, what's his name? Ben Santer, who is the lead author and who considers himself as the climate guru. He wrote, he tweeted, "Climate change denier has no place at Lawrence Livermore." He doesn't like Steve Koonin's book, but I encourage you to look at the excerpts of that book, and the book is now available. It was published about 3 to 4 weeks ago. Steve Koonin, Unsettled, What the Climate Does, What It Doesn't. And he is also now putting out large uncertainties in the climate science. Besides that, I think you must have all heard about the group called the Clintel Group, led by Dr. Gus Berkhout of Netherlands. Now, the Clintel Group has close to 1,000 scientists like us who have expressed doubts about the climate change. That group is now planning to prepare a booklet which will come out in about August of this year, something like that. And they are now proposing that the next COP meeting, COP meeting, which will be held in Glasgow, they are saying that the meeting must be now online and no big demonstrations. In fact, Boris Johnson would like to have some 30,000 people attend that, but I think they are refraining from that. They are saying that let's have the meeting online and no big groups. Let COP, let IPCC produce their drafts and let's make the comments. So the meeting should be rather in a simple, without any fanfare. The meeting should be just like any other document. There are so many scientific documents that keep coming out every week, every 2 weeks. So why make a big fanfare about one climate change document? So I think that is what should happen, and hope it will be happening.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Sadaf, for your question. So I'll move on to the next question for Sylvan. If you'd like to go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary Jean. And this question goes to anybody who's interested. I can't help but feel right now that a global shutdown based on a virus will soon be replaced by a global shutdown based on a molecule, carbon dioxide. And all of us feel the pain associated with the COVID shutdown. And my question is, what kind of real pain should we expect from the possible climate shutdown, which may happen? To anyone, please.
Well, I don't think it's going to happen. The pain you feel along the way is inflation. The price of gasoline in the United States, which was mostly around $2 a gallon a few months ago, will get to $4 a gallon. The price of lumber to build a house has tripled since this president was elected. Our electric bills will go up, I would say, 30% easily by the end of the year. So everybody is going to be experiencing an economic loss. They're going to get less for their dollar, and eventually they're going to feel the pinch. But the pandemic shut down the world, there's no question in my mind. It was put out there either originally accidentally or on purpose by China. Once it got out there, China saw the gigantic economic gain they would get from it, since they don't have much value for human life over there. But I do not see there's a parallel, certainly, that you've described very well, between the carbon dioxide molecule that they're trying to paint as evil, just as the coronavirus clearly was evil. But they are very different, and we won't get the kind of shutdown that we've been subjected to. First of all, everybody's hated it. It's been a disaster. It caused gigantic damage. We're not going to let it happen again. That's what they want. The shutdown, the pandemic was training, really training for subjecting the population to total government control, which clearly is worse in Canada than in the United States. But your question is a good one. Your recognition of the similarity between the two, I'm quite confident it won't go 20% as far as the pandemic went in controlling our lives in a very negative way.
I'll try to make a brief comment as well. What I see happening is more kind of a slow increase in the intensity of the restrictions and of the costs that are imposed on the Canadian public as a result of climate policy. This is very deliberate. It's kind of like they were boiling a frog just a great degree at a time. So I don't think we're going to see dramatic changes in the cost of living in 1 year over another, but it will be constantly rising, and the restrictions will continue to increase, and they'll change in nature. I mean, now we face restrictions like in terms of what we can buy, is increasingly what we can buy in a vehicle, what appliances we can buy, and so on. We're moving into an era when the governments are going to require airlines that fly internationally to buy permits to fly. And there'll be tradable permits. And the results of those permits will be that it will significantly increase the cost of airfares. And I mean, potentially by 2030 or beyond, doubling the cost of airfares from what they are today. Now you might say, well, okay, that's only going to affect the rich, but there's a lot of people who are not terribly rich but like to fly to Florida, occasionally like to fly across the country to see family, and those kinds of changes will occur. I think what COVID has done is I agree with others, it has laid the groundwork for people to accept authority largely without question. And that's a very troubling trend, which we're all going to have to watch as time goes on.
Okay, thank you very much, both.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. All right, so next up for questions, we have Joanne Morin. If you'd like to go ahead and ask yours. This is for Joanne Morin, if you're still here.
Joanne Morin?
Okay, maybe she's not here anymore. I'll go on to the next one. If she's here, we can ask that after. Next, we have Gordon Miller.
Go ahead, Gordon.
Thank you. I just wanted to add a comment about these models. Whenever we get into discussions of the models, we start getting into where they go wrong. But in fact, they're totally farcical in the first place when you consider that they're trying to measure where carbon dioxide is going and where temperature is going and relating it to carbon dioxide. But they fail to take into account 500 million years of carbon dioxide declining on a straight line on a logarithmic scale. We were running out of carbon dioxide. We learned how to at least uncapture carbon dioxide by burning fossil fuels. It may actually extend life on Earth. This argument doesn't ever seem to come up in connection with the models, but in fact, it's a very simple model, a straight line down. Would anyone like to comment on that?
Yeah, Gordon, I want to say, this is Jay Lehr, I want to thank you for your comment. I am in the process of writing an article. The first oil well in the United States was drilled by Edwin, all of a sudden I've lost his name, it was Edwin Drake in 1859, somewhere in Pennsylvania. And the article I'm writing is that Mr. Drake ultimately saved the world. I mean, the discovery of oil, the ability to burn oil as energy, which put carbon dioxide back in the air, which exactly as you say had declined precipitously close to 180 parts per million, where plants start to die. If it ever got to 150, we could pretty much kiss life on this planet goodbye. So the point you make is exactly accurate, and we need to turn the argument from carbon dioxide is bad to carbon dioxide is wonderful. And of course, since we've been burning fossil fuel since World War II, we've greened an additional 25% of our planet, and it's all good. But hopefully, if I can get my article saying that Edwin Drake in 1859 set about basically to save the world as we know it, we may be able to eventually turn the argument exactly as you recognize.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, and that is that Patrick Moore is the one person until recently who's been pushing this idea, and he said that he's had no particular scientific arguments against what he said. So it's a very valid point, and it reminds me very much of Newspeak out of 1984, the book 1984, War is Peace. You know, they would say the opposite of what was reality, and then, of course, one enemy one year was your friend the next year, and then suddenly somebody else was your enemy. I think that we have to be very careful to contest them on their use of language, because it is indeed warping the population's mindset. I mean, they think of carbon dioxide as carbon pollution, as Prime Minister Trudeau calls it, and President Biden. So we have to constantly bring up the points that you brought up, that carbon dioxide is a good thing, and that's why they pump it into greenhouses at double and triple the level that we currently have it in the atmosphere, and that most plants around today evolved at a time when CO2 was much higher. So we're talking about a huge benefit attributed to our burning of fossil fuels. Now, of course, we should control pollution, but I'll tell you the truth. I mean, I hope CO2 doubles, triples from what it is now. No negative effect to us, only positive effects to the biosphere.
That's true.
Yeah, great. Thank you. All right, and so we have another question. Brian Micavena. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name right. If you'd like to go ahead, you can ask your question. This is Brian. You have a question still? You're welcome to go ahead. I think you're still on the list. No, it doesn't look like he's still on the list. So we will, Rosemary Spataro, if you'd like to go ahead. I saw you had a question in the chat.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your esteemed reports and presentations. Very much appreciated. How do you propose that we shoot down basically the reports from the UN? Because as I see it, is the UN's agenda, and particularly now as well in the Vatican with the Pope, with the climate change agenda. How do we counteract those arguments?
One thing that people can do is to call into radio talk shows. It's very difficult to get your point of view published, even in a letter to the editor in most newspapers, because they simply censor them out. But in radio talk shows, I think it's very worthwhile calling in. When you hear things like a climate emergency, call in and say, okay, how much has it warmed since 1880? Oh, 1.1 degrees. That's not a climate emergency. There's no increase in extreme weather. None of these things constitute an emergency. And I think that's one place to start. Jay was saying how you talk to individuals that you know, and that also is a way to start. But I think calling into talk radio is important, because before they know it, your voice is being out there, it's heard by 10,000 people, and it becomes more and more politically acceptable to ask these awkward, inconvenient questions and to provide the answers if they don't know the answer.
I'd like to, I'm really glad you brought up the Pope. I've been contacted by Catholics that really want scientists to face off with the Pope. I mean, he is an avowed communist, and he is listening to people who are all leftists and are also using climate change as a scare tactic to basically turn communism as the political movement of the entire world. And I'm seeing more and more Catholics turned off by it. And I think eventually a significant element of the Catholic population is going to move to our side, recognizing that the Pope has waded into waters that he has no right to as a religious icon. So I think eventually he's going to do us some good and harm to the side that he's supporting.
There's one additional point, and that is that what the Pope is doing, and then to some extent what people in the United Nations are doing, is raising climate change as an ethical issue. The basis of that is their claim, of course, that changes in the climate threaten the existence of mankind. That's not shown by the models at all. Even the most extreme scenarios in the models don't show that. But there's kind of a broader response to the ethics associated with climate change, and that is that the effort to significantly reduce people's use of energy services upon which not only standards of living, but life in many places depends, is a direct threat to the poor in the developing countries. There's over 1 billion people in the world who do not have access to electricity, who depend for their heating and cooking upon burning animal dung, which creates enormous indoor air pollution and causes all kinds of cardiovascular diseases in the developing world. That's the reality. When people talk about electric vehicles, they never mention the fact that most of the lithium that is being produced in the world to serve the needs of electric vehicles is mined in artisanal mines in the Congo, which employ 40,000 children as laborers. So there are very significant ethical problems associated with the way the Western world is approaching reducing greenhouse gas emissions as well. That needs to be added to the discussion.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to it. That point that you just made, Bob, about the ethical side of our argument and how it actually should be part of the argument. In addition to calling into talk radio and making these points, a good approach is to send these arguments to your member of parliament. And then when you call into the talk radio show, you say, and I sent it to my MP so-and-so, and I'm going to call you back in a couple of weeks and tell you what they say. Then you take the audio, if it's on the web, and send it to your MP. Right away, they have much more reason to take your letter seriously. I worked as a legislative assistant in the year 2001, I guess it was. 7 months, that was about all I could stand. But regardless, what I found is if there was no media attached to points of view that were being given to them by public or even experts, most MPs didn't care. They really got so many emails, they would just forget them, and you'd be lucky to get an answer at all. Certainly it wouldn't influence them. But if they thought that their answer or their lack of an answer was going to be on the radio next week, they take it far more seriously. So that combination of calling a radio talk show, sending an email or whatever to your MP, and then updating the radio station as to what your MP said or didn't say, and share that with your MP as well. Pretty quickly, they'll take it much more seriously.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Rosemary, for the question. So next we have Paul Douglas. If you'd like to go ahead and ask your question, we're all ears. So if Paul Douglas is still here, I'm going to check the participant list.
Yeah, he was 90.
Yes, you're here. So we can't hear you. If you'd like to go ahead, you can ask your question. So if you can unmute yourself, we can.
Yeah, he asked a question in the chat 10 minutes ago, so he's around, or he was.
Yeah. So yes, if you'd like, you can either turn on your microphone or you can type it in the chat and I will read it out. All right, so I'm just going to go back and see if any of the other participants were there who had said they had a question. So Joanne Morin, is she here, or either Brian McElvenna? So we didn't get your questions. If either of you are still here and would like to ask. All right, well, that sounds like everyone's.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe it's trivial and maybe it's not your field, but everybody's talking about the polar bears.
Oh.
The polar bears are dying out, you know, and their tiny little floating icebergs are melting. They will have no place to lay their heads on. What's happening with the polar bears? Is the population of polar bears decreasing?
We know exactly what's happening. The polar bear population has quadrupled since 1960. We have put tags on polar bears for many, many decades, and we calculated in 1960 there were between 5,000 and 6,000 polar bears in the northern hemisphere. We now know there are between 25,000 and 30,000 polar bears. We plotted them by satellite. They feed at Churchill, Manitoba. You can go see them. Don't get close to them. They're quite violent. But the polar bears have been thriving. And the interesting thing, we've plotted 14 major families, covens, whatever you call them, of polar bears in the northern hemisphere. And 12 of them are increasing in size. The only two that have had a slight decline in population are those in the warmest areas of the north hemisphere. So everything, the polar bear was used as a nice, warm, supposedly fuzzy icon. As I said, they're very dangerous animals, and everything about them that you've ever read in the mainstream media has been wrong, has been upside down. They have never been endangered. Thank God they can swim 100 miles. They've existed for 100,000 years when the temperature varied all over the place. They're in very good shape, and it's amazing that the left continues to use them as an icon as more information creeps out about the fact that they're doing just fine.
Yeah, we actually put a Climate Change Minute on polar bears. Mary Jean put it up on Twitter, and within one day we had over 2,000 views. I just shared it actually at 9:31 p.m. on polar bears, so I hope folks can share that around further, because it's got to be ironic that they use a species that's not at risk to talk about a fictitious problem that isn't existing. So maybe it's appropriate in a way.
But it's also well to point out that the world's leading expert on polar bears is Dr. Susan Crockett. Is that her name correctly? In any case, she has written widely about how well they're doing, and they've tried to destroy her career. I mean, the left is mean, and they go after anybody that denies what they're saying about climate, polar bears, or any other potentially endangered species. They are mean, and they have tried to destroy that poor woman.
Yeah, that's Susan Crockford, and Mary Jean just put a link to her website. She's a very, very nice lady and certainly an expert in the field, and she shows exactly what Jay is saying, that this is a complete hoax.
Oh,
Yes,
can I ask a last question? Okay. Well, I know how to contact and follow Tom. I just subscribed to your email newsletter on your website there. Thanks for providing that link. Now, is there any way we can follow the progress or the thinking or the research of the rest of you, either directly or through Tom and Mary Jean?
With Jay Lehr, it's very easy. I write weekly, along with Tom and I co-author articles every single week at America Out Loud, where our radio show, we have an hour radio show that's on at America Out Loud. It's a web-based radio station. It's on 24/7. We're on the weekends at 11 in the morning, Saturday and Sunday, and 8 in the evening. It's the same show, but it's aired 4 times, and then it goes to a podcast. But I write separately on a website called cfact.org. It's Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow. And every single week I write a new article. And if you go to cfact.org and to their website, there are many authors just like me. And you scan down and you find an article that I've written in that week or the week before, and you click on my name, up will pop 100 articles I've written there in the last 2 years, more than you'd want to read, but you scan through, look at a title that you're interested in, and I'd say the bulk of my articles are either on energy or climate change.
Yeah, and I just put a link to the America Out Loud page. I think most of the people in this listening audience will really like it for many reasons. And our radio show is there, as well as our articles. You can keep up to date with us through the ICSC-Canada.com website for Bob Lyman, because I'll be publicizing, of course, a lot of his work, which is also with friendsofscience.org. But, and Jay is, of course, working with me regularly. And Madhav, he does a lot of work also through Friends of Science. I've seen a number of good things there. So just put yourself in the subscription list. You go to our website, icsc-canada.com, and we'll keep you up to date regularly.
Tom, I have about 200 articles on the Friends of Science.
Sorry, what'd you say, Bob?
I have about 200 articles on the Friends of Science.
Okay.
And recently I've been doing a number of articles for the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. Their website is one where I deal with kind of shorter items.
Great. And Madhav was actually a speaker at one of the recent Friends of Science events, so it would be up on the friendsofscience.org site that Mary Jean just put in the comments.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. So I think we've gotten to the end of our questions, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We certainly had a very enlightening discussion with the speaker's question, answering the audience questions, as well as the ones that I posed. Would any of the panelists like to give any final words, any short message for the audience?
I would like to thank you, Mary Jean, for putting this together. We've been on for 2 hours, and it's gone like 5 minutes to me. I have never enjoyed listening to people so well the last 2 hours. It has been absolutely a delight, and we owe it all to you, Mary Jean.
Yeah, hear, hear.
Oh, well, thank you, and thank you so much for joining us.
I should also point out that for anyone who is interested, there is a series of reports. You see about 1,000 pages is this one called Climate Change Reconsidered. And you can see it on the web, climatechangereconsidered.org. And it includes thousands of scientific references from leading experts around the world supporting much of what we're saying. Mainstream media are ignoring it. I gave a copy directly, personally, to Catherine McKenna, and her major comment was that it was heavy to carry back to her car. I mean, she was a nice person to talk to, but clearly had no concept of the debate that's really in the community.
I would like to thank
Hey, bye, everybody.
Hey, thanks, Jay.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us, and we will be getting a recording as well. So everyone who signed up who had emails, we'll be sending it to you as well, so you can go back, listen to it, or share it with any of your friends and family. So
Mary
thank you
Jean,
again,
thank
everyone.
you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you
for now.
so much. Just a great presentation.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Mary Jean,
everyone.
for organizing.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom. Thank you,
Yeah.
Bob. Thank you, Mary Jean.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you so
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.